The autumn of 1892 arrived in the rural mill town of Ashford Springs with an unsettling silence. The leaves turned crimson and gold, but the usual laughter of children playing near Widow's Creek had faded into something far more disturbing. Parents began locking their doors before sunset, whispering prayers they hadn't spoken since childhood. Because in the span of 3 weeks, 5 children had vanished without a trace, and the only connection between them was a place everyone in town knew, but few dared to discuss. The abandoned textile mill that loomed beside the creek, like a rotting tooth in the landscape. The mill had been silent for 7 years, ever since the fire of 1885 claimed the lives of 14 workers during the night shift. The official report blamed faulty machinery and inadequate safety measures, but the families of the dead knew better. They spoke of locked doors, of supervisors who disappeared before the flames were discovered, of screams that echoed through the valley long after the bodies were buried. The owner, a man named Cornelius Ashford, had sold the property to a Boston investment firm and left town within a month, never to return. The building stood empty now, its windows shattered, its brick walls blackened by soot and time. Now, as October deepened and the temperatures dropped, something had awakened in that forsaken place. The first child to disappear was Thomas Whitmore, age 9, who told his mother he was going to collect chestnuts near the creek. When he didn't return by dinner, his father organized a search party that combed the woods until dawn. They found his leather satchel caught on a branch 50 yards from the mill's eastern wall, but nothing else. No footprints, no signs of struggle, no trail to follow. His mother collapsed when they brought the empty satchel home, and for 3 days she could not speak. The second disappearance happened 4 days later. Margaret Sullivan, 11 years old, was walking home from her piano lesson when she took a shortcut through the old mill workers' path. Her music books were discovered the next morning, scattered across the path as if she had dropped them in haste. The pages were damp with creek water, though the path was nowhere near the water's edge. Her father, a respected physician in town, offered a reward of $200 for any information leading to her return. No one came forward. By the time the third child vanished, the town was gripped by fear that bordered on hysteria. Clara Henderson, age 8, disappeared from her own backyard while her mother hung laundry not 20 feet away. Her mother swore she heard Clara laughing, then silence, and when she turned around, the child was gone. The only clue was a set of small footprints leading toward the creek, and beside them, larger prints that seemed too wide, too deliberately placed to be natural. The sheriff examined the tracks and said nothing, but those who saw his face reported that he looked like a man who had glimpsed something beyond his understanding. Sheriff Edmund Garrett was a practical man who had served in the Union Army and seen enough horror to last several lifetimes. He didn't believe in ghosts or curses or the whispered legends that old women shared over tea. But even he couldn't explain the pattern emerging before his eyes. Each disappearance occurred within 2 hours of sunset. Each child was last seen near Widow's Creek or the abandoned mill. And each time, there were no witnesses, no ransom demands, no bodies to recover. It was as if the earth itself had opened and swallowed them whole. The fourth child to vanish was Daniel Murphy, 10 years old, the son of the town's blacksmith. Daniel was a brave boy who had once killed a copperhead snake with a stick to protect his younger sister. He disappeared while checking his father's fish traps along the creek, and this time, searchers found something that made even the sheriff's hands tremble. Carved into the bark of an oak tree near the mill race was a symbol, a circle bisected by 3 parallel lines, crude but deliberate. Beneath it, scratched into the wood as if with fingernails, were the words, "They wait below." The discovery sent shockwaves through Ashford Springs. Suddenly, the disappearances weren't just tragedy. They were something darker, something intentional. The town meeting hall filled that evening with over 200 people, their faces pale and drawn. They demanded answers, they demanded action. And when Sheriff Garrett stood before them, he knew that the comfortable explanations he had been clinging to were no longer enough to calm the rising panic. Sheriff Garrett organized the largest search operation in the county's history. 70 men from Ashford Springs and neighboring towns gathered at dawn, armed with rifles, lanterns, and grim determination. They would search every inch of the mill and the surrounding woods. They would dredge the deeper pools of Widow's Creek. They would leave no stone unturned until they found something, anything, that explained what was happening to their children. The mill loomed before them in the grey morning light, more menacing in daylight than it ever seemed at dusk. The main structure was 3 stories of red brick, with a tall smokestack rising from the northern end like a skeletal finger pointing at the sky. The loading docks had collapsed years ago, and the wooden water wheel that once powered the machinery hung broken and still, half submerged in the creek. Broken glass crunched under their boots as they approached the main entrance. Inside, the air smelled of mold, rust, and something else, something organic and rotten that made several men cover their noses with handkerchiefs. The main floor was a vast open space where rows of looms had once stood. Now there was only debris, collapsed beams, tangles of rusted machinery, piles of decaying fabric that had been left to rot after the fire. Pigeons nested in the rafters, and their droppings covered everything in a white crust. But it was the silence that unnerved them most. No birds sang, no rats scurried in the shadows. The mill was as quiet as a tomb. They split into groups. Sheriff Garrett led one team through the main floor, checking every corner, every pile of rubble, every space large enough to hide a child. Another group ascended the creaking stairs to the second floor, where the administrative offices had been located. A third team searched the basement, where the boilers and coal storage rooms sat in perpetual darkness. The remaining men spread out along the creek, searching the banks and probing the water with long poles. Hours passed. They found nothing but rats' nests, broken furniture, and the lingering smell of old smoke. The second floor yielded only rotting ledgers and rusted file cabinets. The basement was a maze of pipes and shadows, but empty of any sign of the missing children. By noon, frustration was setting in. Some men suggested they were wasting their time, that whoever had taken the children had long since fled the area. But Sheriff Garrett refused to give up. It was Thomas Whitmore's father, Benjamin, who made the discovery that changed everything. He had been searching alone near the mill race, the channel that diverted water from the creek to power the wheel. The channel was mostly dry now, choked with leaves and debris, but as he walked along its length, he noticed something odd. A section of the brick wall that lined the channel seemed different from the rest, newer somehow, though still weathered by years of exposure. He called for the sheriff, and together they examined the wall more closely. The bricks were the same color, the same age, but the mortar between them was slightly different, less degraded. Sheriff Garrett pulled out his knife and scraped at the mortar. It crumbled easily, far too easily for something that should have been decades old. Within minutes, they had removed enough mortar to loosen one of the bricks. Behind it was not solid earth, but darkness and the smell of damp stone. They worked quickly now, pulling out brick after brick until they had created an opening large enough for a man to squeeze through. Sheriff Garrett lit a lantern and peered inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. It was a tunnel, roughly hewn from stone and earth, sloping downward into blackness. The walls were damp and lined with what looked like wooden support beams, old but sturdy. Someone had built this passage deliberately, and recently enough that it hadn't completely collapsed. The sheriff called for volunteers to follow him into the tunnel. 6 men stepped forward, including Benjamin Whitmore, who refused to be left behind. They lit additional lanterns and squeezed through the opening one by one, their boots splashing in the shallow water that pooled on the tunnel floor. The tunnel descended at a steep angle, forcing the men to brace themselves against the walls to avoid sliding. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell of damp earth gave way to something fouler, a mix of decay and chemicals that burned their throats. The wooden support beams showed signs of recent repair, the wood still yellow and fresh in places. Someone had been maintaining this passage, keeping it stable and accessible. After what felt like an eternity but was likely only 10 minutes, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. Sheriff Garrett raised his lantern, and the light revealed a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The chamber was roughly circular, perhaps 20 feet across, with a ceiling high enough for a man to stand upright. But it was what filled the chamber that made the men gasp in horror and disbelief. Along the walls were sleeping pallets, 7 of them arranged in a rough circle. Each pallet had a thin blanket and a small wooden crate beside it. On the crates were items that clearly belonged to children: a rag doll, a set of marbles, a tattered book of fairy tales, a harmonica. In the center of the chamber was a crude table made from wooden planks, and on the table were the remains of meals, bread crusts, apple cores, a jar half filled with water. Someone had been living here, keeping children here, and recently. Benjamin Whitmore lunged forward with a cry, recognizing his son's leather satchel among the items. But Sheriff Garrett grabbed his arm, holding him back. The chamber was empty now. Whoever had been here was gone, and the children with them. Rushing forward blindly would help no one. They needed to search methodically, gather evidence, find any clue that might lead them to where the children had been taken. They spread out, examining every inch of the chamber. One of the deputies found a second tunnel on the opposite side, this one even narrower than the first, sloping further downward. Fresh footprints marked the muddy floor, small prints mixed with larger ones, all heading deeper into the earth. Sheriff Garrett made a decision. They would follow the tracks, but they needed more men, more light, and weapons. He sent 2 deputies back to the surface to gather reinforcements while he and the remaining men pressed forward into the second tunnel. This passage was different from the first. The walls were natural stone, not excavated, suggesting they had entered a cave system that predated the mill by thousands of years. The tunnel twisted and turned, sometimes widening into small grottos, other times narrowing until they had to proceed single file. Water dripped from the ceiling, and in places they had to wade through pools that reached their knees. The lantern light cast dancing shadows that played tricks on their eyes, making them see movement where there was none. They had traveled perhaps a quarter-mile when they heard it, a sound echoing from somewhere ahead, faint but unmistakable. It was a child crying. Benjamin Whitmore broke into a run, splashing through the water with reckless abandon. Sheriff Garrett and the others followed, their hearts pounding, hope and dread warring in their chests. The crying grew louder, joined by other sounds now, whimpering and the soft murmur of frightened voices. The tunnel opened into another chamber, this one much larger than the first, a natural cavern with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above them. And there, huddled together against the far wall, were the children. All 5 of them. Thomas Whitmore, Margaret Sullivan, Clara Henderson, Daniel Murphy, and the 5th child who had vanished just 2 days earlier, a girl named Emma Foster, age 7. They were dirty, frightened, and thin but alive. Benjamin Whitmore rushed to his son, dropping to his knees and pulling the boy into his arms. The other men moved quickly, gathering up the children, wrapping them in jackets, speaking soft words of comfort. The children were in shock, some crying, others staring blankly as if unable to comprehend that rescue had finally come. But as Sheriff Garrett counted heads and confirmed that all 5 were accounted for, a cold realization settled over him. Where was their captor? The question had barely formed in his mind when the answer came in the worst possible way. The lanterns flickered as a draft of air swept through the cavern, and then from somewhere in the darkness above came the sound of falling rock. The first boulder struck the ground 10 feet from where they stood, shattering on impact and sending shards of stone flying in all directions. Sheriff Garrett shouted for everyone to move, to get the children back into the tunnel, but more rocks were already falling. A deliberate cascade triggered by someone or something hidden in the darkness above. The cavern was collapsing, and they were trapped in the center of it. The men formed a protective circle around the children, shielding them with their bodies as rocks rained down around them. One deputy was struck in the shoulder and went down with a cry of pain. Another felt a stone graze his head, drawing blood, but they kept moving, pushing toward the tunnel entrance, carrying the smaller children, dragging the wounded. The noise was deafening, the crash of stone on stone echoing through the cavern like thunder. Sheriff Garrett was the last to enter the tunnel, and as he glanced back, he saw something that made his blood freeze. High up on the cavern wall, barely visible in the dying light of the dropped lanterns, was a figure. It stood in what appeared to be a natural alcove, watching them flee. The distance and darkness made it impossible to see clearly, but the sheriff got an impression of unusual height, of limbs that seemed too long, of a stillness that was profoundly unnatural. Then the figure stepped back into the shadows and was gone. The retreat through the tunnel was a nightmare. They had to move carefully to avoid dropping the children, but speed was essential, as the sounds of collapsing rock continued behind them. Water that had been ankle-deep before now surged around their legs, as if the collapse had broken through to an underground stream. The children were silent now, too frightened even to cry, clinging to their rescuers with desperate strength. They reached the first chamber to find it damaged, but still intact. The support beams groaned ominously, and cracks had appeared in the ceiling, but the space was holding. The reinforcements Sheriff Garrett had sent for were just arriving through the entrance tunnel, their shocked faces reflecting the chaos they had stumbled into. He ordered them to start evacuating immediately, passing the children up the tunnel toward the surface, then helping the wounded men who could still walk. 20 minutes later, they emerged into afternoon sunlight that seemed impossibly bright after the darkness below. The children were immediately surrounded by townspeople who had gathered when word of the discovery spread. Mothers wept and clutched their returned sons and daughters. Fathers stood with tears streaming down their faces. Dr. Sullivan examined each child, checking for injuries, his hands shaking with relief at finding his daughter Margaret thin but unharmed. But Sheriff Garrett couldn't share in the celebration. He stood apart from the crowd, his mind replaying what he had seen in that cavern. The figure on the wall, the deliberate nature of the collapse, the fact that whoever had kept these children prisoner had planned an escape route and had been watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. This wasn't over. Not by a long measure. As the doctor finished his examinations, he approached the sheriff with a grim expression. The children were dehydrated and malnourished, but physically unharmed. No signs of beating or abuse. But they were traumatized, barely speaking, and when they did speak, their stories made no sense. They talked about a tall man who brought them food and water but never spoke. They said he would stand in the darkness and watch them for hours. They said he had been preparing them for something, though they couldn't explain what. Young Thomas Whitmore, the first to be taken, was the most coherent. In a halting voice, he told the sheriff that the man had taken them one by one down even deeper tunnels than the ones they had found, into chambers where the walls were carved with strange symbols. The man had made them touch the walls, trace the symbols with their fingers, as if teaching them something. And in the deepest chamber there was a door, not a wooden door or metal, but something else, something that looked like stone but felt warm to the touch. The man had been trying to open it. Sheriff Garrett listened with growing unease. This wasn't the work of a simple kidnapper or a deranged hermit. This was something planned, methodical, and connected to something deeper. He thought about the symbol carved into the tree, the circle bisected by 3 lines. He thought about the tunnel system that predated the mill. And he thought about the legends that the older residents whispered about, stories about the land before the town was built, about why the creek was called Widow's Creek. As darkness fell and the crowd finally dispersed, taking the children home to warm beds and hot meals, Sheriff Garrett made a decision. He would go back into those tunnels. He would find out who or what had taken those children and why, and he would make sure this never happened again. Sheriff Garrett assembled a team of 12 men, all volunteers who understood the danger they were walking into. He chose carefully, veterans who had steady nerves, men who could keep their heads in a crisis, and most importantly, men who could keep their mouths shut about what they might find. The last thing Ashford Springs needed was mass panic based on half-understood glimpses of something that defied explanation. They entered the tunnels at dawn, carrying not only lanterns but also oil lamps, coils of rope, pickaxes, and enough supplies to last 2 days if necessary. Sheriff Garrett had interviewed the children extensively the night before, drawing crude maps based on their descriptions of the deeper chambers. Thomas Whitmore's account of the warm stone door particularly troubled him. No natural geological formation should feel warm in underground caves, where the temperature remained constant and cold year-round. The first chamber showed signs of the previous day's evacuation, scattered belongings, overturned crates, and the muddy boot prints of the rescue party. They didn't linger, pressing forward into the second tunnel toward the cavern where they had found the children. The collapse had worsened overnight. Large sections of the ceiling had fallen, blocking the passage in places. They had to dig through rubble and shore up weakened sections with timber they had brought for that purpose. It took them 3 hours to reach the cavern, and when they did, the sight made several men curse under their breath. The cavern floor was littered with boulders the size of wagon wheels. The natural alcove where Sheriff Garrett had seen the figure was now obscured by fallen rock, but more disturbing was what the collapse had revealed. Where the ceiling had caved in, they could see another level above, another tunnel system running parallel to the one they were in. Sheriff Garrett ordered 2 men to remain at the cavern entrance as a safety point, while he led the rest deeper. According to Thomas's map, there were 3 passages leading from the far side of the cavern. They needed to find which one led to the chambers, with the carved symbols and the mysterious door. The leftmost passage was partially collapsed and clearly unused. The center passage showed fresh marks on the walls where something had brushed against them repeatedly. They chose that one. This tunnel was different from the others. The walls weren't rough stone but showed signs of tool marks, as if someone had widened a natural passage deliberately. Every 50 feet or so, they found crude oil lamps mounted on iron brackets driven into the rock. The lamps were empty now, but the brackets were new, the metal still bright and uncorroded. Someone had invested significant time and resources into making this passage navigable. The tunnel opened into a series of connected chambers, each one revealing more evidence of prolonged occupation. In the first chamber, they found sleeping quarters more permanent than the makeshift pallets where the children had been kept. A proper bed frame, a table with chairs, shelves carved into the rock walls, holding books, tools, and jars of preserved food. Someone had been living down here not for weeks, but for months, possibly years. The second chamber was a workshop. Tables held carpenter's tools, metalworking equipment, and what appeared to be geological surveying instruments. Maps covered one wall, detailed drawings of the tunnel systems with measurements and annotations in a neat, precise hand. Sheriff Garrett studied them closely. The maps showed tunnel networks extending for miles in all directions, some marked with symbols he didn't recognize, others with notes about stability or water flow. One tunnel was marked with a red X and the notation, "Primary Access Active." But it was the third chamber that truly shook them. The walls here were covered floor to ceiling with carvings, not crude scratches, but intricate designs that showed skilled craftsmanship and deliberate planning. The symbols were unlike anything Sheriff Garrett had seen. Geometric patterns that seemed to shift and flow when viewed from different angles, spirals within spirals, and recurring images of circles bisected by parallel lines. Between the carved symbols were written passages in what appeared to be Latin, though none of the men could read it well enough to translate. In the center of this chamber stood a stone pedestal, and on the pedestal lay a leather-bound journal. Sheriff Garrett approached it cautiously, as if expecting it to vanish or explode. The journal was thick, hundreds of pages filled with the same neat handwriting they had seen on the maps. He opened it to the first page and began to read by lantern light. What he found there made his hands shake. The journal belonged to a man named Silas Reeve, and it detailed over 15 years of obsessive research into what he called the old foundations. Reeve had been a surveyor hired by Cornelius Ashford in 1877 to assess the land before the mill was built. During his survey, he had discovered the cave system and, deeper still, what he described as structures of impossible age and origin, predating any known civilization in the Americas by thousands of years. Sheriff Garrett read Silas Reeve's journal by the wavering lamplight, and with each page, the situation became clearer and more disturbing. Reeve had not been a madman or a criminal, at least not initially. He had been a man of science, educated at Yale, respected in his field. But his discovery in these caves had consumed him, transformed him, driven him to actions that crossed every line of morality and law. According to the journal entries, Reeve had found evidence of a civilization that existed in this region long before the Native American tribes, long before European settlement, perhaps even before recorded human history. The cave system wasn't natural. It was built, carved from living rock by people who possessed engineering knowledge that shouldn't have existed in ancient times. And at the heart of this underground complex was what Reeve called the threshold, a doorway that led somewhere the journal's clinical language couldn't quite describe. Reeve had spent years mapping the caves, excavating collapsed sections, and studying the symbols carved into the walls. He had learned that the symbols weren't decorative, but functional, a kind of written instruction manual for operating the threshold. The circles bisected by lines represented dimensional barriers, The spirals represented the energy required to breach those barriers, and the geometric patterns were, in Reeves' theory, mathematical formulae of extraordinary complexity. But here was where the journal entries took a dark turn. Reeve had determined that the threshold required a specific type of energy to activate, something he described as resonance of innocence and vitality. In plain terms, he needed children. Their presence, their touch, their life force somehow interacted with the symbols in ways that adult contact did not. The journal entries from 1890 onward detailed his first attempts to test this theory, luring street children from Boston during his visits there, bringing them to the caves, teaching them to trace the symbols. Those early attempts had failed. The children had been too damaged by hard lives, too aware of the world's cruelty. Reeve needed children who still possessed what he called uncorrupted resonance, children from stable homes, children who still believed the world was fundamentally good. That was why he had returned to Ashford Springs. That was why he had taken the 5 children whose families loved them, whose lives were secure and happy. Sheriff Garrett felt sick as he read the detailed accounts of the kidnappings, the careful stalking of each child, the planned routes through the tunnels, the preparations of the holding chamber. Reeve wrote about it all with the detached tone of a scientist documenting an experiment. There was no remorse, no recognition that he was destroying families. There was only the work, the goal, the threshold. The most recent entries were the most chilling. Reeve had been close to success. The children had traced the symbols enough times that the walls in the deepest chamber had begun to show what he called activation response. The stone had grown warm. Patterns of light had appeared beneath the surface, flowing along the carved channels like luminous liquid. The threshold was responding. Just a few more sessions, Reeve believed, and it would open. But then the rescuers had arrived. Reeve had been forced to flee deeper into the cave system, using passages and shortcuts he had discovered over 15 years of exploration. He had sealed sections behind him, triggered the collapse in the cavern to cover his escape. The journal's final entry was dated the previous evening, written in a hand that showed signs of stress, the letters jagged and uneven. Reeve wrote that he would have to start over, find new children, begin the preparation process again. But he would not give up. The threshold was too important. What lay beyond was worth any sacrifice. Sheriff Garrett closed the journal and looked at his men. Their faces reflected the horror he felt. This wasn't the work of a monster in the traditional sense. Monsters could be fought, killed, understood on some basic level. This was something worse. A brilliant mind turned to evil purpose, a man who had convinced himself that the enormity of his goal justified any means to achieve it. They needed to find Silas Reeve before he could hurt anyone else. The journal mentioned hidden passages, escape routes known only to him. Sheriff Garrett studied the maps on the wall, trying to guess where Reeve might have gone. The notation, primary access active on one tunnel, suggested it was Reeve's main route in and out of the complex. They would start there. The passage marked on the map led them deeper than they had gone before, descending at a steep angle, until Sheriff Garrett estimated they must be 200 feet below the surface. The air grew noticeably warmer, and they began to hear a sound like distant rushing water. The tunnel walls changed character, becoming smoother, showing clear evidence of being shaped by tools or something even more precise. They emerged into a chamber that stopped them all in their tracks. This was no natural cavern. This was a constructed space, vast and symmetrical, with walls that rose in perfect curves to meet at a domed ceiling 30 feet above. The walls were covered in the same symbols they had seen before, but here they were larger, more elaborate, and they glowed with a faint phosphorescent light that made their lanterns almost unnecessary. And there, set into the far wall like a massive door in a cathedral, was the threshold. It was exactly as the children had described, a surface that looked like stone, but seemed to absorb and reflect light in impossible ways, creating the illusion of depth where there should be only solid rock. The temperature in the chamber was significantly warmer than the tunnels, and the air had a strange quality, a thickness that made breathing slightly difficult. But the chamber was empty. Silas Reeve was not here. Sheriff Garrett's sense of relief was short-lived, as one of his men called out from the far side of the chamber. They had found another passage, this one showing signs of very recent use. Fresh footprints in the dust, a dropped tin cup still containing water, a lantern hung on the wall with oil still burning in its reservoir. The fresh trail led them through a narrow passage that twisted like a snake through the rock. They moved as quietly as possible, weapons ready, every shadow a potential ambush point. The passage eventually opened onto a natural ledge, overlooking an enormous underground gorge. Far below, perhaps 100 feet down, they could hear the rush of water, an underground river that explained the sound they had been hearing. And there, on a narrow path that clung to the gorge wall, was Silas Reeve. He was exactly as the children had described, tall, painfully thin, with long limbs that seemed out of proportion to his torso. He wore dark clothing caked with mud and rock dust, and he moved with a strange, jerking gait along the path, as if his joints bent at unusual angles. He carried a canvas pack on his back and a lantern in one hand. He had not yet noticed the men on the ledge above him. Sheriff Garrett made a decision. They could not let Reeve escape into the deeper cave system, where they might never find him. He cupped his hands and shouted, his voice echoing across the gorge. Silas Reeve stopped, slowly turned, and looked up at them. Even from this distance, even in the poor light, they could see his face, and what they saw made several men take involuntary steps backward. Silas Reeve's face was wrong. Not disfigured, not injured, but wrong in subtle ways that violated every expectation of human anatomy. His eyes were set too far apart, and they reflected the lantern light like an animal's eyes. His mouth was too wide, stretching nearly to his ears when he smiled, which he was doing now. And when he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the space between them, a voice that was too deep, too resonant, as if it came from a much larger chest cavity. He told them they were too late. The work was done. The threshold had been opened, just a crack, just enough. He had felt it happen during the collapse, when the children's fear had spiked to maximum intensity, when their life force had burned brightest. The door had opened for just a moment, and something had come through. Not into this world, not yet, but into him. He was changed now. He was becoming something more than human. And when the transformation was complete, he would open the threshold fully. Sheriff Garrett ordered his men to find a way down to the path. They scattered, searching for a route, but the ledge offered no easy descent. The drop was sheer, and the path Reeve was on could only be accessed from further along the gorge. Reeve laughed, a sound that echoed unnaturally, repeating and overlapping until it seemed like multiple voices laughing at once. He told them they could not stop what was coming. The old ones would return. The world above would be reclaimed. Humanity's brief moment of dominance was ending. Then he turned and continued along the path, moving faster now, his inhuman gait carrying him quickly away. Sheriff Garrett made a desperate choice. He grabbed a coil of rope from one of his men, tied it to a rock outcropping, and began lowering himself down the cliff face. It was madness, a 70-foot descent in poor light with no proper equipment, but he could not let Reeve escape. Two of his men, including Benjamin Whitmore, followed without hesitation. The descent was treacherous. The rock was slick with moisture from the river below, and the rope cut into their hands as they controlled their fall. Twice Sheriff Garrett's boots slipped on wet stone, leaving him swinging free above the void. But they made it, all three of them, landing on the narrow path with their hearts hammering and their hands bleeding. They could see Reeve's lantern perhaps 200 yards ahead, bobbing as he moved away from them. They ran. The path was barely 3 feet wide in places, with the cliff wall on one side and empty space on the other. The roar of the underground river was deafening now, making communication impossible. They had to trust that their footing would hold, that the path would not suddenly end or collapse beneath them. Benjamin Whitmore, younger and faster than the others, pulled ahead, driven by rage at what Reeve had done to his son. The path widened suddenly, opening onto a natural platform where the river created a small pool before continuing its underground course. And there, cornered with nowhere left to run, was Silas Reeve. He had set down his lantern and his pack, and he stood facing them with his arms spread wide, still smiling that horrible too-wide smile. He spoke, and his words chilled them to their cores. He thanked them for coming. Their presence was fortuitous. He needed life force to complete his transformation. And while adult energy was not as pure as children's, it would suffice in sufficient quantity. He had been changed by what came through the threshold, given gifts and abilities beyond human limitation. And he was hungry. What happened next would be debated for years afterward among those who survived. Benjamin Whitmore, overcome by rage and grief for what his son had endured, charged at Reeve with a primal scream. Silas Reeve moved, and the movement was not human. He was there, then he was not, then he was behind Whitmore, one hand wrapped around the man's throat, lifting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. The other two men raised their rifles and fired. The bullet struck Reeve in the chest and shoulder, impacts that should have killed or at least incapacitated him, but he only staggered, dropping Whitmore, who fell gasping to the ground. Black fluid leaked from the wounds instead of blood, and as they watched in horror, the wounds began to close, the flesh knitting together with visible speed. Reeve laughed again, that terrible multi-layered sound, and lunged at them. The fight that followed was desperate and brutal. Reeve was stronger and faster than any human should be, but he was still somewhat bound by physical form. They attacked from multiple angles, using their rifles as clubs when shooting proved useless, driving him back toward the edge of the platform. Reeve fought with inhuman fury, his two long arms sweeping them aside, his impossible strength breaking bones with casual swipes. Sheriff Garrett felt ribs crack when Reeve's fist connected with his side. Benjamin Whitmore's arm hung at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. But they kept fighting, kept pushing, because the alternative was unthinkable. If Reeve escaped, if he completed whatever transformation was happening to him, he would return for more children. He would open the threshold fully. Whatever horrors lay beyond would be unleashed on an unprepared world. It was the third deputy, a young man named Coleman, who had said little during the entire expedition, who saw the opportunity. While Reeve focused on the sheriff and Whitmore, Coleman circled behind him, grabbed the canvas pack Reeve had dropped, and hurled it off the platform into the river below. Reeve's reaction was immediate and extreme. He screamed, a sound like metal tearing, and spun toward the water. In that moment of distraction, Sheriff Garrett tackled him at waist height. They went over the edge together, falling 12 feet into the churning pool. The water was shockingly cold, fed by snowmelt from mountains miles away. Sheriff Garrett lost his grip on Reeve immediately, the current separating them, pulling them both downstream. He fought to keep his head above water, slamming into rocks, spinning in eddies that threatened to drag him under. He caught glimpses of Reeve ahead of him, being swept along by the same current. The underground river carried them perhaps half a mile before spilling them out into a larger cavern where the water deepened and calmed. Sheriff Garrett dragged himself onto a shallow bank, coughing up water, every breath sending pain through his damaged ribs. He looked around for Reeve and found him 30 feet away, also on the bank, also struggling to rise. But something had changed. Reeve was moving slowly now, almost sluggishly, and the confidence had left his unnatural face. Sheriff Garrett realized what had happened. The transformation Reeve was undergoing was not complete. It required whatever was in that pack, some artifact or substance Reeve had been using to accelerate the process. Without it, he was caught between human and something else, neither fully one nor the other, and the strain was destroying him. Even as the sheriff watched, cracks appeared in Reeve's skin, and that black fluid leaked from them, more of it now, pooling on the ground. Reeve tried to speak, but his voice was broken, the words distorted and mixed with sounds that hurt to hear. He crawled toward the water, perhaps thinking he could retrieve the pack, perhaps just trying to escape. Sheriff Garrett forced himself to his feet and staggered after him. Despite everything Reeve had done, despite the evil he had committed, part of the sheriff wanted to understand. He needed to know why. Why risk everything, destroy so many lives, for what lay beyond the threshold? He reached Reeve as the man collapsed at the water's edge. Up close, the extent of the transformation was horrifying. Reeve's bones were visible through translucent patches of skin. His eyes had changed color, shifting between human brown and something that reflected no light at all. When he breathed, it sounded like wind through a cavern. Sheriff Garrett knelt beside him and asked the question that had haunted him since reading the journal. What was worth this cost? Reeve's answer came in fragments, broken syllables that the sheriff had to piece together. Knowledge, power, immortality. The things beyond the threshold had been gods once, or close enough to gods that the distinction didn't matter. They had built empires that spanned dimensions, civilizations that made human achievement look like children playing with mud. And they had been sealed away by something, some catastrophe or war, that even Reeves' research couldn't fully explain. But the seals were weakening. Time was eroding them. Eventually, they would fail regardless. Reeve had wanted to be the one who controlled that moment, who stood at the threshold when it opened and negotiated humanity's place in the new order. He had wanted to be transformed, to become something that could survive what was coming. The children were just tools, their innocence a key to unlock ancient mechanisms. He had felt no guilt because from his perspective he was trying to save the species, even if his methods damned him personally. Sheriff Garrett listened as Reeves' voice grew weaker, the words coming slower. The man was dying, the incomplete transformation tearing him apart from the inside, and as the end approached, something like human emotion returned to those alien eyes. Reeve whispered that he had been wrong. The transformation was not a gift, but a trap, a trick played by things that viewed humans as less than insects. They did not want allies or servants. They wanted the threshold opened so they could feed, and they had used his arrogance and ambition to bring them closer to that goal. With his last breath, Reeve told the sheriff to collapse the threshold chamber, to seal the tunnels, to bury everything so deep that no one would ever find it again. The symbols could not be allowed to exist where curious minds might study them. The journal had to be destroyed. Every map, every note, every piece of evidence of the old civilization had to be erased. It was the only way to prevent someone else from making his mistakes. Then Silas Reeve died, and his body began to dissolve in a way that no human corpse should, the flesh turning to something like ash that the river water washed away, leaving behind only bones that looked ancient and weathered, despite having been alive moments before. Sheriff Garrett stood alone in the darkness, his lamp lost in the river, relying on the faint phosphorescent glow that came from algae on the cavern walls. It took him 4 hours to find his way back to the others. He followed the river upstream, climbed where he could, and eventually heard voices calling his name. Benjamin Whitmore and Deputy Coleman had made their way back to the upper tunnels and organized a search party. When they pulled Sheriff Garrett up onto the familiar passage near the threshold chamber, he was hypothermic, badly injured, and barely conscious. But he was alive, and Silas Reeve was dead. The next 2 days were a blur of activity. Sheriff Garrett, despite his injuries, supervised the sealing of the tunnels. They used dynamite salvaged from a mining operation 20 miles away, carefully placing charges to collapse key sections while avoiding damage to the town above. The threshold chamber was the first to go, tons of rock burying the mysterious door and the glowing symbols. Then the connecting passages, the workshop chambers, the living quarters, all of it brought down in controlled explosions that shook the ground. They found Reeves' journal and maps in the symbol chamber before the collapse. Sheriff Garrett read through every page one final time, memorizing key details in case someone needed to know in the future, then burned the journal in a fire that took 3 hours to consume all the pages completely. The maps were destroyed the same way. Every physical piece of evidence that the old civilization existed was systematically eliminated. The official story, the one told to townspeople and recorded in county records, was that Silas Reeve had been a disturbed hermit who lived in natural caves near the mill. He had kidnapped the children in a fit of insanity, kept them in the caves, and died when the tunnels collapsed during the rescue. The children, when questioned, were confused about details and traumatized, so their accounts of carved symbols and mysterious doors were attributed to fear and darkness, playing tricks on young minds. Within a year, most people had accepted this version, and the children themselves began to doubt their own memories. The mill was torn down in the spring of 1893. The lumber was sold, the bricks were broken up for road fill, and the land was eventually sold to a farmer who planted apple orchards. Widow's Creek continued to flow, peaceful and ordinary, and new families moved to Ashford Springs who knew nothing of what had happened in the autumn of 1892. The 5 children grew up, married, had children of their own, and rarely spoke of their experience. Thomas Whitmore became a teacher, Margaret Sullivan a nurse, Clara Henderson a writer of children's books, Daniel Murphy a minister, and Emma Foster a botanist. They lived good lives, though each of them had nightmares until the day they died. Sheriff Edmund Garrett, served 3 more terms before retiring in 1904. He never spoke publicly about what he had seen in the deep chambers, never told anyone the full truth about Silas Reeve's transformation or the warnings Reeve had given before dying. But he kept a private record, sealed and held by his attorney, with instructions that it should only be opened if similar disappearances ever occurred in Ashford Springs or the surrounding area. That record has never been opened. The children of Ashford Springs remained safe, playing near Widow's Creek, collecting chestnuts and skipping stones, unaware of what lay buried far beneath their feet, sealed away in the darkness, waiting with the patience of things that measure time in eons rather than years. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.